Hi there, guys. My name is Siobhan Fallon. Welcome back to Custer's Seventh Cavalry. Today, we're going to continue talking about the life of Charles Varnum. And we left off in part one. And if you haven't seen part one, I recommend when you get a chance, you watch it. We left off on June 25th, 1876, after Major Marcus Reno's retreat from the valley. So just as I did in part one, anytime I can let Varnum speak for himself using his unfinished memoirs, interviews, letters he wrote, and also his testimony from the Reno Court of Inquiry, I'm going to let him paint his perspective of that fight and the events in his life. And he has some really interesting insights into Marcus Reno as well as George Armstrong Custer. Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Enjoy. As I mentioned earlier, I have a part one out, and this is what it looks like. And in that episode, we covered Varnum's earlier military exploits, including how he stopped a prisoner escape, how his bravery in the Yellowstone fights greatly impressed his commander, George Armstrong Custer. And this is one of the more iconic photos of the officers of the 7th Cavalry at Fort Abraham, Lincoln, on Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's porch around 1873. And a fellow I know, Paul Noble, cleaned this photo up, and it's so clear and wonderful. I'm going to do a quick rundown of some of the other officers. This is young Varnum. Here's a close-up. At the time of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Varnum had just turned 27 years old, so keep that in mind. This is Nick Wallace, Varnum's West Point roommate and very good friend. This is Benny Hodgson, who was killed during Reno's retreat from the valley. Here is Varnum's company commander, Captain Miles Moylan. And let's see, this is McIntosh, who also died during the valley retreat. This is Tom Custer, George Custer's younger brother. He's wearing his 2 Medal of Honors that he was awarded in actions during the Civil War. This is George Yates, and here is James or Jimmy Calhoun, who married Custer's little sister Maggie. So guys, we're going to start in the morning of June 25th, 1876. In the very early morning, Varnum, who was chosen to be the chief of scouts, went to the Crow's Nest with the Indian scouts, and he was there when they shared their intel with Custer. A few hours later, Varnum joined Major Marcus Reno's column as it was sent into the valley to bring the Indian warriors to battle. I already shared Varnum's account of this scene in part one, but I want you to hear this version that he wrote to Charles Bates because there's some more detail. Varnum emphasizes his friendship with Wallace, and he sums up his view of Custer. I remember distinctly as I rode away to join Reno in his attack, I being in charge of the Indian scouts, except the 5 who were with Custer. I looked back and saw Lieutenant Wallace, who was my most intimate friend, riding by General Custer. I shouted out to him the following: "Come on, Wallace, don't stay back there with those coffee coolers. Come with the fighting men." Custer heard it, shook his fist at me as if he was very angry, and motioned Wallace to go with me. Then Custer raised his hat as if in a bantering way, acknowledging the joke in which he seemed to greatly relish. This saved the life of Wallace. He is probably one of the very few men in the United States Army whose life was ever saved by a joke. I must have been on fairly intimate terms with General Custer, for he was the kind of man who kept officers at a distance as a rule. He looked the part of an officer always, but I suppose that I had been in 2 pretty sharp Indian fights in 1873 under him, and that therefore I had gotten into a relationship that made him lenient with what he would have regarded as impudence on the part of some officers who did not know him so well. I mention this because it shows that Custer's spirits were far from being depressed on the eve of the big disaster. As his old father summed up his character, "My son was not reckless. They should not say that. He fought to whip." Reno's column did not fight in the valley for long, and for more on that valley fight, please see part one. Suddenly, the Indians began advancing towards us, and looking back, I saw the troops were dismounting to fight on foot. We rode back to the line of troops, which rested its right on the timber which bordered the stream. Across the timber, on the side of the stream, was a high bluff, and looking up, I saw the Gray Horse Troop E in column. So I knew that some troops were passing to the other end of the village via the bluffs. There were plenty of Indians, and the fight waxed hot. We had about 120 men total. When asked if Custer's column could have seen Reno's men in the valley, Varnum testified, "As this column of General Custer's went down the stream, he may have been in a position to see us all the time we were going down to the bottom. I do not know exactly where it was he was moving down to on the right bank of the stream, but he must have seen us all the time. But as it passed the point I have described, we were certainly dismounted, and he must have been in a position looking down to the bottom of seeing what we were doing." Varnum testified they were in the timber for about 10 to 13 minutes. Varnum found Reno right with G Company, evidently deploying it or assisting to deploy it to go through the woods. Reno said to Varnum, "I wish you would go back there from the line in the front and see how things are going and come back and report to me." Varnum did so, but by the time he came back, he heard from the woods cries of "Charge! Charge! We are going to charge!" There was quite a confusion. I didn't hear any orders. I heard no bugle or trumpet call sounded at the time Major Reno's force left the woods on the retreat. Varnum noted the command was on the run, but I was on a thoroughbred horse from the Kentucky racetracks and soon overtook the column. Multiple witnesses testified Varnum shouted for the soldiers to go back for the wounded and to fight. Varnum said, "I was soon at the head of the column, and I tried to check it, saying we could not run away from the Indians. We must get down and fight." However, Major Reno was at the front of the retreat and told Varnum he was the officer in charge. Varnum remembered, "Sergeant Culbertson and I caught a loose M Troop horse and put a wounded man on it as we went up with the troops." The wounded man was Varnum's own orderly, Private Elijah Strode. Varnum testified, "I don't know exactly what did happen at that time at the head of the column, because my orderly that had been with me was very badly shot, and his horse was shot, and his horse fell down with him there, and I stooped to pick up a loose horse and mount my orderly. Major Reno's column reached the top of the bluffs and stopped." Varnum testified, "They were very much demoralized when they got on the hill after the retreat." Varnum also said, "I can't speak for anyone else. I can only speak for myself. I felt as though I had been very badly licked." Then messengers were sent to the pack train to hurry it up. Colonel Benteen with 3 troops, Troops D. Weir, H. Benteen, and K. Godfrey. Captain McDougall with Troop B and the pack train also joined us. Colonel Reno learned that Lieutenant Hodgson had been killed when we crossed and went down to the crossing with some men. You probably all remember that this was when Captain Frederick Benteen shows Major Reno the order he received, written in the hand of Lieutenant Cook, Custer's adjutant, of "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." Benteen suggested they make a juncture with Custer, but Reno halted him, saying he had lost half of his command. So Benteen's column of fresh troops, as well as ammunition packs that had been cut loose and hurried along to Reno-Benteen Hill, and the entire pack train stayed with Reno's column. When asked about whether the troops on Reno-Benteen Hill heard Custer's firing, Varnum testified, "A little time after Benteen came up, I heard firing there away by the stream, and I spoke of it to Lieutenant Wallace. I had just borrowed a rifle from Lieutenant Wallace and fired a couple of shots at long range on the bottom. Just as I was handing back the rifle, I heard firing, and I said, 'Jesus Christ, what does that mean?' It was not like a volley, but heavy firing, a sort of crash, crash. I thought Custer was having a pretty warm time down there. There was a lot of very hot firing, evidently." Personally, I can't help but think of the faith Custer had in his junior officers, which he mentioned in the days leading up to the Little Bighorn fight, and wonder if these feisty young men may have handled things differently. Lieutenant Godfrey remembered Custer, quote, taking particular pains to impress upon the officers his reliance upon their judgment, discretion, and loyalty. Lieutenant Edgerly remembered Custer saying, "We are going to have a hard ride, for I intend to catch these Indians if we have to follow them to their agencies, and I expect a great deal from you young officers." Okay, back to Varnum. We had a number of badly wounded men, and to move they had to be carried in blankets. We had no stretchers. The trail followed by Custer was found back from the bluffs, and he must have been engaged in the valley from where I saw the Gray Horse Troop. When he was asked at the Reno Court of Inquiry about how much time had elapsed from the time Major Reno first got to the top of the hill until this whole body of Indians were coming up near enough to begin firing, Varnum replied, "I should think about 2 hours from the time he first came up there to the time I saw Captain Weir on this point." After helping with the wounded, I joined Captain Weir with the advance. We moved to a place that overlooked where Custer's fight took place, but it was covered with Indians riding in every direction. A considerable firing was heard, but there were no body of troops in sight. We saw a lot of white objects scattered about, which I thought were rocks, but which we found out afterwards were the naked bodies of Custer's men. By this time, from every hill and vale, Indians were coming up the river towards us. Reno started to fall back along the bluffs to find a favorable place to stand them off, which was near where we came up from the valley. Reno and Benteen formed the line. Godfrey, with his K Troop, dismounted, covering the movement. It was very late in the p.m. when we were in shape, and probably 5,000 Indians attacked us. We had about 300 men. Our line formed a semicircle from the crest of the bluff. It was very steep and high up from the river. Except across the middle point of the semicircle, we had a slight slope to cover us, and across the low point made a sort of breastwork of pack saddles. There were only 1 or 2 spades with the packs. We had the entire reserve supply of ammunition, and plenty to eat, and some grain for stock, but water was almost inaccessible. Near the center we placed animals, and in the center of that we placed our wounded. We had Dr. Porter. The Indians fired at us from behind a circle of hills varying from 200 to 500 yards. They would pour lead into us for 15 or 30 minutes, and then charge us mounted. We lay low while they were firing, and when they charged, we sat up and let them have it and drove them back. This they kept up incessantly, as long as we could see, until the night of the 26th. We managed to get a few canteens of water that night and the following day from the river, but it was very risky work. We had a few cans of tomatoes among our stores also. These and the water was mostly consumed by the wounded. As I had no sleep for 48 hours, I went to sleep around midnight. I was awakened by being carried and found myself in the arms of Private Tony Seibelder, Troop A, who, when the firing opened in the morning at about 3:00 a.m., found me in a very exposed position. He laid me down, and I slept for a while and felt better. I was awoken at sunrise. During the forenoon, we were bothered by 2 or 3 Indians who got a position on the edge of the bluff down the stream. At Benteen's suggestion, the troops in that flank charged them. We were opened on by the whole circle. I felt a pain in both legs at once, and thought for a second I had lost both legs. I got a bullet through the calf of one leg, and as my foot was up, while I was running, the other went down my leg, cutting the yellow stripes off my trousers and denting the leather of my boot over the ankle bone. It did not touch my person, but acted as a blow against my ankle bone, and the foot swelled up and turned black and blue, and was really the worse of the 2. I dropped into a shallow trench when I got back, and I tried to examine the hole in my leg to see how bad it was, but every time I did so a bullet cut the dirt very near it. A young private of B Troop got to laughing at my endeavors, and while doing so, a bullet went from the top of his head down through his body. He probably never knew what happened to him. My wound was not examined till the following day. I, later in the day, went to Captain Moylan's line and with other officers talked over our situation. I suggested I would try and get away during the night if I could get a good man to go with me and carry the news and try to get relief. Sergeant George McDermott of A Troop agreed to go with me, and I went to see Major Reno about it. He was with Captain Weir. I made my proposition to him. He did not reply for some time, and then said he could not afford to lose 2 good shots, and that we would get killed anyway. I said we might as well get killed trying to get relief as to getting killed where we were. He said, "Varnum, you are a very uncomfortable companion." Weir came to me afterwards and said Reno would let me send scouts if they would go. I had only 4 left with me, White Swan, who was badly wounded, and Half Yellowface of the Crows, and Goose, also wounded, and Forked Horn of the Reese. After long talks, they finally agreed to try to get help out that night, and Reno gave me notes to give them. They did not go, however. Guys, remember these messages that Varnum was so desperately willing to carry out. They will come up again later. That evening all was quiet, and everyone seemed of the opinion that troops were coming to our assistance, and that the Indians had gone. We sounded trumpets, giving the various calls to warn any troops when close. We got nearer the water, and after midnight sent horses down to water, a few at a time. At about 9 o'clock, dust was seen down the valley, and from its regular formation we soon made out a cavalry column. It was General Terry with 4 troops of Second Cavalry and 6 companies of the 7th Infantry. The general and staff came up to us. They told us that Custer and the 5 troops with him were all dead, and their naked bodies, mutilated and scalped, were down the river about 3 or 4 miles. Such a scene! I will not try to describe it. Our brother officers and dearest friends, butchered and scalped. We commenced at once to remove the wounded to the 7th Infantry camp. Surgeons got to work. Saddler Madden had to have his leg amputated at the thigh. By the way, guys, I have a whole video on Sergeant Michael Madden. Please take a look at that next. Everything but the troops was moved that day, and on the morning of the 28th we started to bury the dead. Only a few spades could be procured, and the bodies were covered with earth just as they lay. The officers were all identified except for Lieutenants Harrington and Sturgis. The officer bodies were buried in shallow graves and marked. In the meantime, the infantry had buried the bodies who fell in Reno's first attack. These bodies were horribly mangled. So Varnum does not go into detail about the state of his friends' bodies or the burials, and there is a reason. Remember how Varnum pestered Reno into trying to send word out on June 26th, and how Reno would not let Varnum go in search of help, but he relented and said he'd let the Indian scouts go. Well, Reno wrote messages, and then the Indian scouts returned with them. It looks like Varnum had not been content with Reno's message, and he added something of his own, and when the scouts returned with those messages, Reno saw it. So here's part of an interview that Varnum did with Walter Camp in 1909. Varnum said, "When the dead were buried, Varnum and some scouts were posted on high grounds east of Custer battlefield to watch for Indians. This was done by Reno to punish Varnum for adding some additional material to the notes which Reno had tried to send out of lines on June 26th. Varnum was thus not permitted to see any of his friends who had been killed with Custer." During the Reno Court of Inquiry in 1879, the recorder, Lieutenant Jesse M. Lee, asked about these messages, and he asked what they said. Major Reno admitted to having destroyed the notes, so we'll never know what additional material Varnum included that angered Reno so much he would not let Varnum help bury his friends. Captain Keogh's horse Comanche was found alive on Custer Field, but badly wounded. We managed to get him along with us, and he was cured and kept till he died at Fort Riley, Kansas, in 1891, I believe. We moved down the stream a few miles that day, and on the 29th, in the night, when it was cool, on account of the wounded, we marched about 20 miles to the Bighorn at the mouth of the Little Bighorn, where a steamboat, the Far West, waited. Captain Grant Marsh had pushed its way. It was very welcome. I had lost all my baggage, and I managed to get a suit of underwear from the officers of Company B, 6th Infantry, and shave and clean up a bit. Having embarked the wounded, we marched down the Bighorn to the Yellowstone, and were ferried to a north bank where we encamped. An Irishman of Troop A went crazy and had to be tied up and sent to an insane asylum. The 7th Cavalry was reorganized soon. Major Reno appointed commander, and I became a first lieutenant. Then, guys, there are pages missing in Varnum's writings, and he finishes the memoir with this fragment. A long campaign followed this, but nothing was accomplished, and we returned to Fort Abraham Lincoln in September, I think. The cause of the massacre, it seems to me, is that the general divided his command in attacking an enemy many times as large as his own. But the narrative abruptly ends there and was never completed. After the Battle of the Little Bighorn, some relationships between 7th Cavalry officers became a little strained. Frederick Benteen says in a letter to Theodore Golden, "I was ill with a malarious dysentery. However, I was well enough to tell Colonel Weir before a dozen or so officers that he was a damned liar, and this was occasioned by some remarks he made about Custer and Reno and the fight at Little Bighorn, and occurred while we were in camp in August, '76. Colonel Weir said that meant blood. Well, said I, there are 2 pistols in my holster on saddle. Take your choice of them. They are both loaded, and we will spill the blood right here. The crowd went off with Weir with them, and the next time I met him, he shoved his hand out to me to shake. Aha." Edward Godfrey wrote in his journal on July 24th, "Colonel Reno was placed in arrest by General Gibbon." And on July 25th, Godfrey writes, "Colonel Reno got a copy of charges against him. It all comes from Colonel Reno sending out some scouts as vedettes. I presume, however, Colonel Reno's manner has as much to do with the results, as his manner is rather aggressive." And on August 15th, Godfrey wrote, "Major Reno has been playing ass right along and is so taken up with his own importance, he thinks he can snip everybody and comment on the orders he received from General Terry's headquarters and insult his staff, so there's not anyone on the personal staff on speaking terms. I understand that he, Terry, has said if he had not so much respect for the officers of the regiment, he would put some other field officers on duty with the regiment. It seems that Reno's self-important rudeness makes him unbearable." If you guys know Major Marcus Reno's story or have watched my many videos about him, you know he was the subject of more than one court-martial proceeding as well as a very publicized court of inquiry. Well, there were other charges brought against Reno involving Charles Varnum related to the return of the 7th Cavalry, or the Bloody Seventh, as General Terry called them, when they arrived at Fort Abraham Lincoln in September 1876. On September 26th, what began as a celebration for the officers at the newly opened Officers Club ended with Reno being accused of drunkenness on duty, conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, and conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. I'm going to quote from the official charges. "Major Marcus A. Reno, 7th Regiment of Cavalry, being in command of the military post of Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory, at a time when said post was exposed and liable to attack from hostile Sioux Indians, did become drunk." And then Reno provoked a personal encounter with the 20th Regiment infantry officer, 1st Lieutenant John A. Manley, and, quote, did engage in fisticuffs and rough and tumble fight. He did roll on the floor of the officers' clubroom in the slops and filth, covered by spittle and spilling of liquor over said floor. Reno tried to expel Lieutenant Manley from the clubroom, and this is when our Varnum got involved. Reno, quote, by his arbitrary and abusive language, did further provoke a personal encounter with First Lieutenant Charles Varnum. Varnum, having interfered to prevent Major Reno from insulting Lieutenant Manley and expelling him from the clubroom, Major Reno did reply to Varnum in a malicious manner, "If you interfere, Mr. Varnum, I will make it a personal matter with you," thereby inferring that he would challenge Varnum to a duel. And when Captain T.B. Weir endeavored to conciliate him and shake hands with Varnum, Reno did in an insulting and malicious manner strike at the hands of Varnum and say, "Don't you touch my hands." Then Reno did allow for pistols to be sent for the purpose of engaging in such a duel with Varnum, and when told by Lieutenant Robinson that if Reno allowed pistols to be brought into the room for the purpose of dueling, Robinson would place him under arrest. Major Reno did reply, "Who in hell are you?" The witnesses that evening were the post trader, Lieutenant Manley, and a few other infantry officers, as well as 7th Cavalry Lieutenants Eckerson, Robinson, Hare, and of course Varnum. But Colonel Samuel Sturgis disapproved these charges against Reno, though he may have regretted doing so, as Reno would later finally be discharged from the United States Army for drunkenness, as well as looking in the window at Sturgis's daughter Ella in late 1879. Charles Varnum then served as the 7th Regimental Quartermaster from November 1876 through October 1879. In 1877, he participated in the Nez Perce War, fighting at the Battle of Canyon Creek, as well as the Battle of Bear Paw. It was during this campaign that Varnum met Calamity Jane, when she nursed some of Varnum's wounded. He wrote of her, "Then and for many years after, the soldiers expressed their enthusiasm for her nursing in the highest terms." Once more Varnum distinguished himself and was recognized, this time by Colonel Sam Sturgis, of his actions during the Nez Perce campaign. Quote, "The skill and zeal with which our supply train was managed by the regimental quartermaster throughout the whole campaign entitles that faithful officer to special commendation." In 1887, Charles Varnum was himself court-martialed. He was arrested at Fort Meade, Dakota Territory, and tried for a general court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, and found guilty of conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline in causing the wife of a soldier to be placed on a table and whipped with a barrel stave. Varnum received a formal reprimand, which was inserted into his permanent record. The story behind this rather odd situation is that Varnum allowed the men of his company to discipline the unfaithful wife of a sergeant. When you read about the 7th Cavalry and the frontier military, you often come across instances of corporal punishment. But as Varnum was court-martialed for this, I'm hoping that means this sort of punishment for the spouses was rare. The Battle of the Little Bighorn wasn't the only controversial Indian fight Varnum participated in. He was also at Wounded Knee, and this photo here is of the 7th Cavalry officers around the time of the Wounded Knee campaign, and it's from this website, www.armyatwoundedknee.com, and it's a fantastic website with a lot of eyewitness accounts, and this is where I found the photo. So let's quickly go through these gentlemen who've aged a little bit since the last time we saw a group photo. Here is Edgerly, who was Thomas Weir's second lieutenant at the Little Bighorn. Here's Varnum, who seems like he's seen a lot in the decade and a half that's passed. Here's Moylan, who was Varnum's company commander, and here is Godfrey. And a detail I really love about this picture is clearly it's very cold, and Moylan doesn't seem to be wearing gloves. He has one of his hands in Godfrey's pocket. So It just says a lot about the friendships of these men. Okay, so you guys probably know some of the background info here, but there was a fear during the ghost dance movement that there would be an uprising, and the Seventh Cavalry was after a group of Sioux led by Chief Bigfoot. They surrounded them, and the warriors were ordered to turn over all of their weapons. They handed over just one rifle. So the next day, Varnum and Lieutenant Wallace, or Captain Wallace at the time, were sent to the Lakota camp to search for the remaining arms that Varnum was sure they were hiding. And this is an excerpt from Varnum's account of what happened next. Drawn up on the banks of a dry branch was the long Indian line formed in a flat arc, facing the line of 2 dismounted troops about 15 yards away. It was bitterly cold. The warriors' blankets covered them completely, exposing only their eyes. My first sergeant and I, with a few men, started the search of the left of the line. The first Indian stood up, threw open his blanket, showing a full belt of cartridges, but no gun. As I was turning to secure a receptacle for the cartridges, the entire hostile line rose to their feet as one man, turned their backs, shook off their blankets, and turning again with their rifles in their hands, fired a volley point blank at the troops. The latter was ready, for there was but one deafening crash as Indians and soldiers fired together. Unwittingly, that one volley of the troops swept through the village and doubtless killed many women and children. Bigfoot fell in the crossfire, and I lost my lifelong chum, Captain Wallace, who met his death in the brush where he had gone searching for arms. The toll was heavy on both sides. My troop alone sustained a loss of 4 killed and 7 wounded. Charles Varnum was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions on the following day at the Drexel Mission fight at White Clay Creek. His citation reads, December 30th, 1890. While executing an order to withdraw, seeing that a continuance of the movement would expose another troop of his regiment to being cut off and surrounded, he disregarded orders to retire, placed himself in front of his men, led a charge upon the advancing Indians, regained a commanding position that had been vacated, and thus ensured a safe withdrawal of both detachments without further loss. And Varnum's military career continued. During the Spanish-American War, Captain Varnum and his 7th Cavalry B Troop went to Cuba, though he did not fare well there and was sent home on medical leave of absence after serving for 6 months. Varnum was promoted to major on February 1st, 1901 with the 7th Cavalry. Then he was transferred to the 9th Cavalry in September 1904 and promoted to lieutenant colonel in April 1905. He transferred again and was sent to the Philippines with the 4th Cavalry in September 1905. Varnum retired from the regular army for disabilities on October 31st, 1907. But he was still too much of a military man, and he remained an advisor to the Idaho militia, then became a professor of military science at the University of Maine, and he also served as a recruiting officer. He was recalled to active duty and promoted to colonel in 1918 during World War I as a finance and disbursing officer at Fort Mason, California. And he finally retired for good on April 8th, 1919. Varnum also had a family. He married Mary Alice Moore of Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1886. They had 3 children, Georgia, John Prescott, and a baby who died in infancy. In Varnum's later years, with all of his traveling, his family often stayed in Minnesota with his wife's family. And I can't help but think of the second paragraph in Varnum's unfinished memoir that we mentioned in part 1, where he spoke of his father during the Civil War. My father was absent in the army, and we seldom hear from him. Varnum's own son was a troubled man who was arrested 20 times in 30 years for impersonation and bigamy. After Varnum's retirement in 1919, he took a flat 5 blocks from the Presidio in San Francisco. He was beloved by the troops there and often met Army friends at the Presidio Officers Club for lunch or drinks. Charles Varnum had known some of the greatest figures of the American West. Varnum outlived all of the 7th Cavalry officers who had fought at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and he even outlived Libby Custer. Charles Albert Varnum died in 1936 at the age of 86. He is buried in the San Francisco National Cemetery. Varnum spent 47 years in the military. 32 of those years were with the 7th Cavalry. Throughout his career, he was repeatedly recognized for courage. So I'm going to close here with this description of him by his friend and 7th Cavalry comrade Luther Hare, talking about Varnum at the Little Bighorn. I saw Varnum a great deal through the fight on Reno Hill, the daring way in which Varnum exposed himself, encouraging the men, confirmed his previous fine record. He was a soldier of magnificent courage. All right, guys, that's all for today. Stay tuned for the next slide. I have my book list, my credits, and a little bit of music. And leave me a comment. I'd love to hear what you thought of this video, and if there's anything else you'd like me to work on in the future. Subscribe to my channel, watch more videos, click the notification bell, and I hope to hear from you. All right, guys, talk to you soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
I'm just a man who's got blood all on his hands, but does a humble sinner still deserve a chance? Hey, say a prayer for me, I think you would advance. Step by step, yeah. I walked 100 miles and I still ain't sure just what I'm trying to